Welcome. It's great to see so many people here, and I think there's probably even going to be more showing up throughout the morning. A lot of familiar faces and some new faces too. So welcome, one and all. I'm John Petty. I'm the Pediatric Trauma Director at Brenner's, and just wanted to be sure everyone knew that you're welcome. We're very excited about our day today. I think we've got a really good lineup of speakers and information and just time to interact with each other. I'm just going to say a few announcements because I don't want to tie up any more time than we need to before we get to our plenary speaker, but I want to say a couple thank yous right off the bat. A special thank you to the Children's Institute for Pediatric Trauma. Where's Michelle? She's floating around. Anyway, they've been very supportive in terms of organizing and planning and helping with some of the financial stuff for this because it is very much at the heart of the mission for the Children's Institute. So thanks to them. We have some vendors outside. I would encourage you all to spend some time at the breaks and at meal time and that sort of thing. Covidian and Osser, who makes the Miami J sea collars, are both here, and we appreciate both their products, their investment in pediatric injury, and also their support here. There are some other displays out there as well, Safe Kids and Brenner Transport. Stephen Wallace has a table there with his book. I'm sure he'll be interested in hearing more about his research. And there are restrooms out under the sort of near the stairwell out there. If you need that, we'll have breaks will be out there. There'll be coffee and sort of little nibbly things throughout the day, and then lunch at the midday break. And at the end of the day, we'll remind again about evaluations for continuing education. My understanding is that if you are from a nursing background and are using this conference toward continuing education, there will be paper evaluations for that. And if you're not, then there will be an electronic version of that. So please do take the time for that so that you get sort of full credit for your involvement today. But also part of that is feedback on the conference. This is our third year doing this. I think every year it kind of gets bigger and better. And the program today is in large part a result of feedback that we got last year. This is something that we try to keep very user-friendly, sort of front lines, helpful, in the trenches kinds of folks that everyone here is at some level. So please do let us know what we can do from an educational standpoint to help you all in the care of the patients that you see every day. I'm going to turn the podium over to Dr. Pranikoff, who's going to introduce our first speaker this morning.
Thank you, and I'd also like to echo my welcome to people for our conference today. Thank you for coming. We're glad you're here. So this morning, it's my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Stephen Wallace. Stephen was trained as a school psychologist originally and an adolescent counselor, and really has a broad experience in these areas over many years. He currently is a senior advisor for policy research and education for SAD, Students Against Destructive Decisions, and served as the national chairman and chief executive officer of this organization for more than 15 years. He is more recently an associate research professor and the director of the Center for Adolescent Research and Education, CARE, at Susquehanna University, his alma mater, and the director of counseling and counselor training at the Cape Cod Sea Camps, where he has been affiliated for over 40 years. Most important to today's topic, he has been a high-profile participant in and commentator on the modern-day adolescent experience. He has received many prestigious honors, including most recently recognition by the White House as a national leader in drug and alcohol education. And in February 2008, he received an award from the American Camping Association for being a tireless, passionate advocate for youth. He's held positions in Psychological Services Department of the Palm Beach County, Florida Public Schools, the Pupil Personnel Services Department of the Millis, Massachusetts Public Schools, and Adolescent Psychiatric Unit of Fair Oaks Hospital in Summit, New Jersey. He served on the Conference of Faculty of Miami Children's Hospital, Division of Adolescent Medicine, and was appointed as a member of the Massachusetts Gubernatorial Task Force on Sexual Abuse and Assault, and was formerly a member of the Board of Directors of the National Commission Against Drunk Driving. On a personal note, I've known Wally for over 40 years, starting as a childhood friend, as a summer camp co-counselor, as a roommate, and recently as a colleague and a lifelong friend. And I am very proud to welcome him to Winston-Salem as a keynote speaker for our 3rd annual Pediatric Trauma Conference. Steve Wallace.
Thank you very much. Wow, that was long. I forgot I did half of that stuff. Thank you very much. Thank you all for being here. I appreciate the kind introduction and the very warm welcome from everybody in this community, both from yesterday when I arrived to this morning. Generally, I speak to large audiences of adolescents, and I never really know how these introductions are going to be received. I was up, as the case may be, in New Jersey, speaking to 6,000 high school students at the PNC Bank Center, which is one of those big outdoor amphitheaters where they have summer concerts. And as I say in my book, there's not a lot about public speaking that makes me nervous, but there was something about 6,000 high school kids right after lunch, all jacked up on Mountain Dew and Jolt, that kind of had the butterflies going. And the organizer of the event picked me up at Newark Airport and drove me down the Garden State Parkway. And he was telling me a little bit about the day, that the kids had been there since 8 a.m., hearing a succession of speakers. While we were driving, they were actually having their lunch. And right after lunch, he had hired somebody to warm them up for my presentation. And I'm thinking, are you nuts? You know, so we get to the facility, they drive me around the back, and I go in the backstage door, and this is just massive facility, and I walk up to these heavy black curtains, you know, and I kind of peer through the crack, and there's this huge stage, and there's nothing on it except a microphone stand and this guy who I describe as sort of a cross between a comedian, an acrobat, and a vaudevillian. And he was whipping this crowd of 6,000 kids into a complete frenzy, and I'm starting to sweat, you know. And he finishes his shtick and he says, "Before I go, I just want to say that you guys are cool." And 6,000 kids go, "Rah!" And he says, "And New Jersey is cool." And with that, they launch out of their seats, and I'm sweating. And he says, "And Bruce Springsteen is cool." And with that, they're doing high fives and fist bumps in the aisle. And then he says, and this was my cue to walk out on stage, "And Stephen Wallace is cool." And as I walked through those heavy black curtains, there was complete silence. And all I could see were 6,000 high school kids turning to each other and mouthing the words, "Who the hell is Stephen Wallace?" Well, I'm Stephen Wallace, not the race car driver. I was stalked by a woman on my website who for some reason thought I was the race car driver, where I think it's pretty obvious if you visit my website that I'm not a race car driver. But I am here, and as Tom said, I'm the founder and inaugural director of the new Center for Adolescent Research and Education, or CARE, at Susquehanna University. So I want to send our best wishes from our crusaders to the Wake Forest Demon Deacons. I'm really delighted to have the opportunity to visit with all of you this morning to talk about really what is one of my favorite topics, and that is the role of prevention in primary care. It's actually something I've been talking about for 20 years, and no one really paid much attention to it. And I'm not sure anybody's really paying that much attention to me, but it is a topic that the federal government is starting to pay attention to and to fund. And I think it's critically important to the practice of treating and preventing injury and illness. So I think that really the goal, of course, is how we might best protect adults and adolescents and children from injury and disease. And I believe that the same approach of prevention in primary care can be used quite effectively in preventing youth risk behaviors, including everything from substance use and abuse to suicide, which is an epidemic, as you may know, reaching staggering proportions. Franklin Roosevelt once said that at any moment of decision, the best thing that we can do is the right thing. The next best thing that we can do is the wrong thing. And the worst thing that we can do is nothing. Well, as someone who travels across this country every week, almost every day, meeting with, talking to, speaking to parents of tweens and teens and with tweens and teens themselves, I firmly believe that we stand at just such a moment of decision. According to my Teens Today research conducted by ORC International for SAD, there occurs a large spike in alcohol use between the 6th and 7th grades, a large spike in other drug use between the 8th and 9th grades, and a large spike in intimate sexual behavior between the 10th and 11th grades. In addition, For young people between the ages of 10 and 24, suicide is the third leading cause of death and results in approximately 4,600 lives lost each year, according to the Centers for Disease Control. And finally, the National Highway Traffic Administration ranks automobile crash deaths as the #1 cause of death for young people ages 8 to 15. And let me dip into those numbers just a little bit, because last week we at SAD released brand new driving research that we did in concert with Liberty Mutual Insurance. Our survey of more than 1,700 11th and 12th graders across the country revealed that while driving, 94% of the teens surveyed say that they speed, 90% say they talk on a cell phone, 78% say they send text messages, 33% drive without a seatbelt, 16% drive under the influence of marijuana, and 15% drive after drinking alcohol. Given these grim statistics, I believe that the stakes for young people and the opportunity for primary care providers have never been greater. I suspect that you, like me, have heard a calling and suggest that every day we must answer that call in a way that supports and protects our children. But too often, I think our line of defense has been fragmented or broken. And I believe that only when we can embrace and advance all of the people and all of the tools at our disposal in the fight against dangerous and sometimes deadly decisions by children and teens can we really begin to bend the curve of risk. So where does that process begin? I suggest it occurs in 3 primary places: at home, at school, and in your practices. Why? Because we know through more than a decade of research that not only are parents incredibly well positioned to guide the decisions of their children, they're actually the #1 reason why kids make good choices. Because we also recognize the power of the peer group. They're the #1 reason why kids make bad choices. But they're also the #2 reason why they don't. And that suggests a tipping point that we need to be mindful of. And last but not least, because we recognize the power of non-parent caring adults to support young people as they work their way toward adulthood. In fact, according to the Search Institute, young people need at least 3 such people in their lives in order to reach their full potential. I have long believed that members of the healthcare community, doctors, nurses, PAs, NPs, first responders, therapists, social workers, and so forth, are perfectly positioned to educate about and assess risk and to begin intervention and referral when necessary. That makes you a critical cornerstone of the villages that raise our children. And when you join with parents and teachers and coaches and counselors in a common approach to education and prevention on issues like underage drinking, other drug use, bullying, violence, sex, and suicide, you too can be a powerful catalyst for change. One of the challenges we sometimes face, however, is a lack of understanding of the real world in which our children live. That is something that I refer to as the reality gap, which is also the name of my book. I define the reality gap as a disconnect between the real world that kids live in and the make-believe world that many of us think that they live in, or hope that they live in, or desperately want to believe that they live in, especially when they're our own children, or children that we have come to love and care about. The reality gap really reflects that disconnect between what issues we think they think are important and which issues they tell us are important. And again, in terms of the behaviors that they're engaging in. Let me give you some examples from my research. Compared to what their parents say about them, high school students are 8 times more likely to say that they're using alcohol. They're 4 times more likely to say that they're using other drugs, and they're twice as likely to say that they're having sex. Again, compared to what their parents say about them. On the issue side of the ledger, that's the behaviors. On the issue side of the ledgers, 83% of the young people surveyed in our research say that they are very concerned with the issue of impaired driving. Why? Because either they're driving impaired, they have friends who are driving impaired, or they're passengers in a car with a driver who is impaired. Contrast that 83% with their parents. And we sample kids and their parents, not just kids and parents, so we can compare apples to apples. Okay, only 40% of their parents, 83 versus 40%, only 40% of their parents say that this is an important issue for their teen. Why? Because we have very much a been there, done that mentality among adults in our country when it comes to the issue of impaired driving. That was the 80s. Check it off the list. Nobody's stupid enough to get behind the wheel of a car after using alcohol. Not true. Is there a consequence? Yes. After decades of decline, we're starting to see a rise in crash deaths among teen drivers. After a reduction of over 60% since 1981, which happens to be the year that SAD was founded, those numbers are starting to turn around. And I believe it's a direct result of taking our eye off the ball. It's a direct result of that disconnect that I'm talking about. Let me talk about teen suicide, something that is near and dear to my heart because I've lost teens close to me to suicide. We gave kids a scale and a number of behaviors where they could rank them in terms of order of importance to them, order of concern to them. They listed teen suicide as number 5 on their list of about 25 risk behaviors. They listed teen suicide as number 5. We gave the same list to their parents and asked them to rank where they thought their kids would put them, right? And they ranked teen suicide as number 17. Number 5 versus number 17. Again, a disconnect. Why are kids so concerned about it? Because either they're anxious, depressed, thinking about hurting or killing themselves. Maybe they have a friend who's thinking about hurting or killing themselves. Maybe they've experienced a loss because of a suicide. Huge issue. Parents are not dialed into that. So again, is it any wonder that we're seeing an explosion in the youth suicide rate? I don't think so. There's a lot of reasons for that explosion, not the least of which is PTSD among children of active military personnel. I'm just wandering around with this water. I'm not actually drinking. But I think it's also the same effect as with the impaired driving. We're just not dialed into it. We're not tuned into it. We're not paying attention. We need to do a better job of educating parents and teachers and coaches and counselors at school about some of the warning signs of suicide. These, of course, are quantitative measures of the reality gap. But more entertaining are the anecdotal ones taken from focus groups that I have conducted. I don't actually conduct them, I watch them through the magic mirror across the country. So I wanted to share a couple, 2 or 3 of those to illuminate this reality gap. I was out in Orange County, California, south of LA, and I was watching a group of high school girls and boys. And the meeting was sort of dominated by this one kid who I describe in my book as the quintessential Southern California surfer dude, right? His name is Jared, and he was kind of tall, and he had shaggy blonde hair and a t-shirt and the little beady things and the cargo shorts and the flip-flops. And I was actually telling this story at summer camp, Cape Cod Sea Camps, at Parents' Weekend, and I described Jared like that. And all of the parents started to laugh, and I didn't understand why that was funny. So I said, "Why is that funny?" And one of the moms just pointed at me, and I realized that I was wearing a t-shirt, cargo shorts, flip-flops, and I had shaggier blonde hair then and my little beady thing. But anyway, I digress. So Jared was busy regaling his peers with all of his crazy stuff, that he was doing, which included smoking marijuana every day on the way to school, using a lot of cocaine on weekends, and washing it down with copious amounts of alcohol. And he said that he was his friend's designated driver because, as he put it, I drive wasted better than anybody else. Now, a few minutes later, I went across the hall where these kids' parents were in their own focus group. And I had a little cheat sheet so I could, figure out who belonged to whom, right? And I actually heard Jared's mother ask the moderator of her group why she was even involved in these discussions, because her son wasn't engaging in any of the behaviors that were being discussed. In fact, he prefers to stay at home and play Monopoly with his grandmother. Now, at that point, I wanted to bang on the mirror, and go, "Wake up and smell the coffee." But for confidentiality reasons, I couldn't do that. A few days later, I was down in Houston watching middle school parents and their kids in focus groups. And I'm watching the parent group, and the subject turned from substance use to sexual behavior. And the moderator was asking each of the parents who were seated at a round table to just say what they thought their child's perspective was on becoming sexually active. And this one mom of an 8th grade boy said that she knew her son wasn't sexually active and didn't plan to become so until he was married. And yet, again, a few minutes later, across the hall watching the kids group, her son was telling the moderator that he had had intercourse the year before in 7th grade with his longtime girlfriend of, I think it was about 6 weeks. So again, you see that reality gap on display. Now, in fairness, we know that young people don't always make it easy to keep up. A lot of them are very forthright and honest about what they're doing. but some work pretty hard to throw us off the scent. One of the things I do at camp is I teach a counseling course in our teen leadership program. So I have a 14-year-old group, a 15-year-old group, a 16-year-old group, and a 17-year-old group. And we meet once a week. And in the 14-year-old group, these are rising ninth graders. I focus on interpersonal communication and team building through group dialogue. And I let them choose the 7 topics for our 7 classes. At the beginning of the summer, I give them a piece of paper and a pencil, and they can write down 7 topics that they want to talk about, and then I aggregate them and I pick the top 7, and that's the curriculum. And one of the things that I discovered after a few years of doing this is that they always write parents. Parents is always one of the items on the list. So I got to that first section on parents, and I said to them, so you guys want to talk about your parents? And they all started going, yeah, we want to talk about our parents. And anybody want to guess what the number 1 issue was they wanted to talk about regarding their parents? I'm sorry? Part of that, yep, listening. Anybody else? Trust. Trust was the biggest issue. Because I said, what is it about your parents you want to talk about? And they started, it was like a free-for-all. Trust, why don't they trust us? Why can't they just trust us? Why do we have to call them all the time? Why are they calling us all the time? And God, why are they calling my friends parents? Right? So I said to them, okay, I think I hear you. So I said, by a show of hands, how many of you would say it's important to you that your parents trust you about, say, where you're going, who you're with, and what you're doing? Oh, every kid couldn't get that, and they made that noise too. Oh, right? So I said, okay, now, how many of you lie to your parents about where you're going, who you're with, and what you're doing? And a significant number, the clear majority of hands stayed up in the air. And I said, you guys see a problem here? And they said things like this. Well, no, we're teenagers. We're supposed to lie. Or it's a game. Right? My parents expect me to lie. So I was really fascinated by that. I called it trust versus truth. And so when I'm fascinated by something, I often put a few questions into a national survey to see how it tests out. So I did that. I put those questions in a survey that went to thousands of high school kids across the country. And here's what I found. 89% of them, almost all, said that it was important that their parents trust them about those things. 89%. Yet only 40% of them actually told their parents the whole truth. Okay? Trust versus truth. Let me give you one more focus group example. I was out in, and this will relate to something I'll talk about later on if I don't run out of time. I was out in Seattle, and it was a mixed high school, middle school group. And the kids were all filing in. And generally speaking, they're kind of nervous when they come in because we recruit from different schools in each city we go to so that we don't have 2 kids from the same school because we don't want them, sort of just posturing for their peers at school. So they're a little uneasy. We feed them pizza in the waiting room, and then they come in. And they usually stop at the mirror. Like a lot of them will come in and they'll go like this. Are my parents in there? And anyway, so there was this one kid in this group. He was an 8th grader named Brian. And Brian just stood out immediately. He sat right by the mirror, right by me, right? And he was a small kid for an 8th grader. But he was wearing this big coat, and he had this wool hat pulled on right down over his eyes, right? And he sat there like this the entire focus group and didn't say a word. But he kept staring in the mirror, like he kept turning and going like this, so his face was about this close to mine, which was really freaking me out. We got to the end of the focus group, and the moderator, who was a woman named Kelly Basile, said, okay, so before I let you guys go, I have to ask you, how is it that you get away with all this stuff and your parents don't know? And this one girl who was a junior, she was about halfway down the table on my right-hand side. She practically slid across the table and, I'll tell you what we do. So Kelly said, all right, what do you do? She said, well, on Friday afternoon, my friends and I will pick a girl who's not very popular, so we know she won't have any plans that night. Nice, right? And we say, hey, can we tell our parents we're staying at your house? And she agrees, right, because she wants to be liked by the cool kids. And, that's the big game, right? Everybody's staying at somebody else's house, and pretty soon nobody knows where anybody is. It's just a big smoke screen. In fact, when we ask kids in our research, what are things your parents could do that would reduce the chance that you would engage in, drinking or drug use or sex? You know what they say? Cut out the overnights. Right? Because that's what they're all doing. So anyway, so this girl says, so at the time that we're supposed to be back at our friend's house and calling our parents to say, okay, midnight, we're back at Susie's house and everything's cool, her parents are here, right? We call Susie She three-way patches the call through to our parents' house, so that on caller ID, it shows up that we're where we're supposed to be instead of where we really are. And with that, Brian jumped out of his seat, pulled off his wool cap, and said, "Wait a minute, tell me how to do that again?" So hopefully I'll have time to get back to Brian. So I call that duplicity in the technological age. So what's your role? What's a caregiver to do? Recognize that as a non-parent adult invested in the life of a young person, you have a unique opportunity to help that patient focus on wellness, i.e. health and safety, in some pretty unique ways. Also, I think you can use your interactions with pediatric and adolescent patient parents to bridge that reality gap by providing some up-to-date, reliable, and results-oriented data and advice that will help to empower them to discuss and guide their child's choices. And therein lies the key. Of all of the prescriptions you could write, the most salient, the one with the most bang for the buck, the game changer is communication. Indeed, all of my research for over a decade shows time and time again the power of open, honest dialogue to alter attitudes and behaviors among young people. Ironically, however, sometimes talking is easier said than done. In his book, Get Out of My Life, but first could you drive me and Cheryl to the mall? Anthony Wolfe recounts the following conversation between parent and teen. "Well, son, what's happening?" "Not too much, Dad, just the usual." "How's school going?" "Pretty good, but I'm still having a tough time with algebra. I just don't know if I can ever get the hang of it. You know, I felt that way about algebra when I was in high school, and I remember getting really down about it. But I hung in there, and finally it ended up okay." "Thanks, Dad. I really liked hearing what it was like when you were in school. Maybe I'll do okay in algebra, too." Now, as you may suspect, that conversation never really happened. But Dr. Wolfe shares my belief that good communication between young people and their parents can and should take place. And it's not always that complicated. Let me share a story with you. I was hanging out with one of my campers, Ben, who was at the time 15. He was a sophomore in high school, a big athlete, lacrosse player, nice kid, nice family, little brother, mom and dad. Spent a lot of time with his parents on the sidelines of his lacrosse games. They'd have me over for dinner frequently, so I really knew the family well. So I was hanging out with Ben one weekend, and I said, "So, you know, what have you been up to?" And he said, doing sports, studying. Most weekends we go skiing, and, you know, up to some mountain somewhere. I'm a Southern boy, so I don't really understand that. But, and I said to him, "So when you're not skiing with your family, what do you typically do on weekends?" And he said, "You know, I hang out with my friends." I said, what does that mean? What do you do?" He says, "Well, you know, we go to parties." And I said, "Really?" He said, "Yeah." And I said, "Are you drinking at those parties?" And he said, "Well, yeah." And I said, "How much?" And he said, "Not much." I said, "What's not much?" He said, "Well, I'll have, you know, 3 or 4 or 5 drinks." And I said, "Do your parents know that?" And he said, "Well, I assume so." I said, why do you assume that they know that you're drinking?" And he said, "Well, they know I go to parties. They know there's alcohol at the parties. So I assume they know I'm drinking." And I said, "Have they asked you?" And he said, "No." And I thought, well, that's odd. And I said, "Well, what would you say if they did?" And he looked at me and said, "I would never lie to my parents." And I believe that, knowing Ben and his family. And I said, "Okay, so they ask you, you say, yeah, you're drinking, and they tell you that they don't want you to do that anymore. What would you do?" And he looked at me like I was crazy, and he said, "I'd stop." And I thought, well, there you have it. It's just that simple. Are you drinking? Yes. Don't? Okay, done. End of story, right? Not so tough. But it's not always, of course, that easy. I'm a former political consultant, and I know that we are in a swing state, so I'm told. So I want to use a political analogy to line up some research on psychographic profiling that I've done. So when you start a political campaign, the first thing that you do, and some of you may know this, is you shore up your base. You go to the people that you know are with you, that are supporting you, sending you money, you know, holding the signs, putting the bumper stickers on their car, and you thank them. You pat them on the back, you tell them they're doing a great job, that you couldn't do it without them, right? And then you leave them alone, because you can't waste your time and your money on people that are already with you, right? On the other end of the political spectrum are the people that are never going to be with you. Regardless of what you do, they're not going to vote for you. So you don't waste time and money on them either, because it's just going to be a waste, right? So where do you focus your attention? The undecideds, that big group in the middle, the undecideds, right? That's where you spend your time and your money and your energy. Now, I created in my research, 3 psychographic risk profiles of young people. And one group we call the avoiders. These are kids that for whatever reason, and there are a lot of them, have decided that they're just not about drinking or using drugs or having sex or engaging in other risky behavior. It's just not who they are. Okay? So those are kind of like the people that are with you, right, in the political analogy. And my analogy is about to fall apart, but bear with me. Okay? On the opposite end of the spectrum, we have kids we call repeaters. These are kids like Jared from California who are regularly engaging in risk behavior. Okay? Now, I'm not suggesting we leave them alone and not spend any money on them. What I'm suggesting is that for mom and dad, that's probably not behavior they're going to be able to change by themselves. They're probably going to need some professional intervention, and they may come to you to help guide that process. But in the middle are a group of kids we call experimenters, not because they're necessarily experimenting, but because they're prone to experimentation. Okay? Some of them are experimenting, some of them aren't. These are kids like Ben. Okay? These are kids that really need the bulk of our time and attention, our expectations, our dialogue. Because as you saw in Ben's case, had his parents asked the simple question and created some expectations for him, he likely would have changed his risk behavior pattern. Okay, so that group of experimenters are the ones that we really need to focus on. What I have also found in my research is that even in highly communicative families, even in families where mom and dad really take the time to talk with their kids about things like underage drinking and drug use and bullying, there's one topic that very few of them tackle. Anybody want to guess what that topic is? Sex. Yeah, it's unbelievable. And to the extent that they do, it's usually directed at girls. And girls get a much more nuanced discussion about sexuality and sexual behavior than do boys, which I'll talk about in a minute. But I read this study that I found fascinating that showed that when moms talk to girls about sex, girls put off becoming sexually active. When moms talk to boys about sex, boys put off becoming sexually active. When dads talk to girls about sex, when dads talk to girls about sex, girls put off becoming sexually active. The one outlier is when dads talk to boys about sex, boys become sexually active earlier. So I was asking one of my Psych 101 classes why they thought that was the case, and this one freshman boy in the back of the room said, "Because it's a pep rally." Okay? So to my point about the gender differences, so when I talk to girls, when I do a lot of IDIs, in-depth interviews with kids as part of our qualitative research, and when I talk to girls and I ask them the question, have your parents talked to you about sex? If they say yes, I say, what kinds of things have they told you? And they start talking about puberty and first menstruation and boys and safety and communication and feelings and all that kind of stuff. When I ask boys that question, 90% of them say no. And they usually go like this, no. And I say, but for the few that say yeah, I say, well, what do they say? And here are some real live responses. They say, well, my dad just handed me a box of condoms. Or my mom said, you better not get a girl pregnant. Okay? So you think qualitatively about the difference between the communication that's taking place and how are we setting up boys for behavior with those types of expectations that we're creating, right? I know you're going to have sex, so at least use a condom. I know you're going to have sex, just don't get a girl pregnant. Those are the messages that boys are getting. And it's creating a lot of pressure to become sexually active, particularly for boys, but increasingly among girls. In all youth risk behaviors, by the way, we're starting to see the paradigm shift from a predominantly male-led endeavor on risk behaviors to a predominantly female-led endeavor. And I have some brand new research coming out about that shortly. I wrote a recent Valentine's Day column, newspaper column called Getting in the Game, Valentine Virgins and Rising Teen Pregnancy Rates, after my then high school age nephew told me about pressure from his friends to have sex, urging him to, quote, get in the game. In her book, You're Teaching My Child What? Psychiatrist Miriam Grossman states that 34% of girls are sexually active by age 15, and that by 9th grade, 20% of teens have had oral sex. Is that inconsequential? I ask again. I don't think so. The CDC reports that the U.S. teen pregnancy and birth STD, STI, and abortion rates are considerably higher than most other developed countries. The CDC's staggering estimate is that 1 in 4 teenage girls ages 14 to 19, not 1 in 4 sexually active teenage girls, but 1 in 4 teenage girls ages 14 to 19 has an STD, STI. So clearly, and as I like to say, these are not your grandfather's diseases. They're not easily treated, as you know, as they were, back maybe when we were teenagers. So clearly, communication is the name of the game. At the same time, so is awareness and action. Awareness of the key drivers of that risk behavior and the actions that we can take to help point youth to the path of safe choices. Let me cite specific examples referencing 6 original constructs that grew out of my research, 2 on the awareness side and 4 on the action side. And I'm sorry I don't have PowerPoint. I'm decidedly low tech. On the awareness side, the first point I already covered. These are what we call decision points. Remember those spikes in behavior? Underage drinking between 6th and 7th grades, other drug use between 8th and 9th grades, intimate sexual behavior between 10th and 11th grades. We call those decision points so that we can focus in on when onset of certain behaviors is most likely to occur. Okay? The second awareness construct we call decision factors. Okay, now we know the decision points. What are the factors that kids are weighing, consciously or unconsciously, when they're making choices about underage drinking, drug use, sex, violence, bullying, whatever? And we identified 4. Number 1 is mental states, not a surprise, right? We link those risk behaviors to anxiety, depression, and boredom in our research. Number 2, personal goals. How do certain behaviors go towards or against the goals I have established for myself, whether be they academic, be they athletic, be they social. 3, potential outcomes. What might happen if I use drugs or drink or get caught or get suspended or expelled? And 4, and this really is points to the primary point of my talk this morning, is significant people. Significant people, not just including mom and dad, significant adults in their lives, and they can be healthcare providers. Yes, they can be healthcare providers. Play a huge role in the choices that young people make. Now let me talk about the action side, and these are 4 constructs that are illuminated more in my book. Number 1, sense of self. That's a pretty common term. If you Google sense of self, you'll find 75 or so different definitions of what it means in a psychological construct. But we created our own measure of sense of self. And what we did, and I could find no other case where this had ever been done before, which surprised me, we took the 3 primary developmental tasks of adolescence, okay? Identity formation, independence, and object or peer relationships. And we created a metric to help gauge where kids stand through self-reporting on accomplishing those tasks. And then we linked those to risk behavior, okay? How well a kid is doing in achieving those developmental tasks linked to risk behavior. Perhaps not surprising, high sense of self teens are more likely than low sense of self teens to report feeling smart, successful, responsible, and confident, and cite positive relationships with their parents. They're also more likely to avoid alcohol and other drug use. We can help children and teens improve on their sense of self, and there's prescriptive advice in my book on how to do that. Number 2, rites of passage. Okay? Almost half of high school teens report parental inattention to what they consider to be key transitions during their adolescence. Right? Remember back in yesteryear and in other cultures, there's all kinds of stratification that sends the message to young people when they are advancing developmentally that we recognize it, we pay attention to it. Right? We're really proud of them, we celebrate it, we have ceremonies to recognize it. A lot of those things have disappeared in our culture. A lot of those things have disappeared. Some still exist, right? I go to a lot of bat mitzvahs and bar mitzvahs for my campers. That's a great rite of passage, and it's all about a rite of passage as it's communicated in those ceremonies. But by and large, we don't do a very good job with that anymore, and that inattention comes with a high price tag. The potential for dangerous behaviors that can lead to illness, injury, or death, as those young people seek what I call alternative milestones to demonstrate growing maturity and independence, right? So kids are trying to say to us, hey, look at me, I'm growing up. I'm not that little kid anymore. And if you're not going to recognize that, I'm going to go out and engage in adult-like behaviors to drive the point home to you that I'm growing up, right? So I'm going to go and drink or use drugs or have sex, because then I can demonstrate that I'm really the adult I think I'm becoming. As with sense of self, there is a direct link between parental recognitions and risk behavior, including substance use and driving behaviors. We can help kids by recognizing their important transitions. Number 3, positive risk-taking. We all know that teenagers are what I call hardwired to take risks, right? It's part of their developmental makeup. They're going to take risks. There has been this tenet in education and prevention for as long as I've been in the field that says, okay, we know they're going to take risks. So if we can only get them to take positive risks, they'll be less likely to take negative risks, right? Makes perfect sense. I could not find one shred of data that supported that tenet. And so I went out and designed a study to test it. And here's what I found. Teens who take positive risks in their lives, their schools, and their communities are 20% more likely than teens who do not to avoid alcohol and other drugs and to demonstrate more interest in their academic performance. There's also a link to mood and mental health. So we can help kids by identifying and encouraging positive risks that they can engage in. And number 4, mentoring. And this is sort of my baby, so I'm going to spend a little more time talking about mentoring. And I know that the hospital here is committed to community service and mentoring, and I want to meet the nurses that dressed up as friendly animals to teach nutrition to the kindergarten. So if any of you are here, please self-identify yourself afterwards. I was very intrigued by that. While parents are critically important when it comes to positive youth outcomes, they are, in truth, just one part of the equation. So as someone who considers myself to be a mentor, I was curious to see if what I do makes a difference. So I checked. I did a lot of secondary literature review, and here's what I found. Mentoring has been shown to enhance school performance, improve relationships with parents and peers, reduce initiation of drug and alcohol use, and decrease incidence of youth violence. We also know that mentoring is closely linked with other important psychological and sociological constructs such as positive youth development, resiliency, and risk and protective factors. Now that sounds good, but all of that data reflects formal or matched mentoring, like big brothers, big sisters. I couldn't find any data that reflected the relationships that kids naturally form in their everyday lives with their healthcare providers, with their teachers, with their coaches, with their camp directors, whomever. So this won't surprise you at this point. I designed a study to look at that. Here's what I found. Teens who identify at least one influential natural mentor in their life report that they have a higher sense of self, right? So we linked it back to our sense of self research, and are more likely to take risks that positively affect their lives, positive risk taking. Additionally, young people with mentors are significantly more likely than those without mentors to also report frequently feeling happy and less likely to report regularly feeling depressed or bored. And notably, more than half of teens themselves say the absence of a mentor would negatively affect them. So what are kids looking for as a mentor, right? If you want to sign up for the job, if you want to apply, you want to know what the job description is. Here's what they say. And these were identified by more than 3,000 middle school and high school students. They're looking for people who are trustworthy, caring, understanding, respectful, helpful, dependable, fun, compassionate, and responsible. Oh, and they also want someone who's a good listener and offers good advice. Sounds pretty difficult, right? Makes you not want to apply for that job. But my camper, 14-year-old Ashley, summed it up by saying this, quote, "Being a mentor to someone does not mean you have to always know the right answer, just that you are always there when they need someone to lean on. Indeed, it's about being present in kids' lives. As Woody Allen said, 90% of life is just showing up, right? And so I spent a lot of time just showing up at sporting events, at birthday parties, at bar mitzvahs. Now you have an advantage because your patients show up in your offices, so it's a little bit easier, right? But it's still having a presence in their lives, right? That is an intentional activity. In camping, we talk a lot about intentional activity. Okay, it doesn't happen by osmosis. It happens because you've intentionally decided that you want to have a presence in the lives of the kids and adolescents that you see. A few years ago, I got, right before camp started, so this is like late May, early June, I'm in full-fledged panic mode. I've just come off of 8 months on the road doing this, and I've got to prepare for the onslaught of 700 kids showing up at camp, along with about 400 counselors to take care of them and train. And I get an email from the mom of one of my campers who was a Boy Scout working towards his Eagle Scout badge. And she said, are there any certified merit badge counselors at camp? Because I'd like John to get checked off for archery and swimming while he's there. And I said, well, that's a good question. I have no idea. I'll check. So I checked, and I wrote her back, and I said, unfortunately, we have John. And she wrote back and said, that's okay. You can be one. All you have to do is take a course, pass an exam, and you'll be a certified merit badge. I wasn't even a Boy Scout. So I wrote her back, and I said, Pat, I'd really like to help. I love John, but I'm really kind of busy right now. And she knows me too well because she wrote back, and all she said was, I know you'll do it for John. So I took the course, passed the exam, and so if any of your kids need sign off on swimming or archery, I'm your guy. I'm glad I did it. John completed his Eagle Scout. I got to go to his ceremony, where John Thing was at, our other roommate, with his kids. It was in a small church on a very hot day in New Hampshire, and it was the singularly longest ceremony I've ever sat through in my entire life, and the most uncomfortable wooden bench I've ever occupied. But it was nice to see John succeed. And as a thank you, his mom sent me a book called This I Believe. Has anybody heard of that? It's based on the NPR radio series, and it's a collection of essays written by people about one thing that they feel passionately about. Some of the people are famous, some of them are just people like you and me. But it's a really compelling and inspiring book. There's a second edition, by the way, not so much. The first one is the one you want to get, okay? And in that, I found a lot of essays that blew me away. But the one that blew me away the most was one that really resonated with my whole concept of just showing up. It's called This I Believe, The Power of Presence. It was written by Debbie Hall, who was also a psychologist. And this is an excerpt. She says, presence is a noun, not a verb. It is a state of being, not doing. States of being are not highly valued in a culture which places a high priority on doing. Yet true presence, or being with another person, carries with it a silent power to bear witness to a passage, to help carry an emotional burden, or to begin a healing process. In it, there is an intimate connection with another that is perhaps too seldom felt in a society that strives for ever faster connectivity. With therapy clients, she said, I'm still pulled by the need to do more than be, yet repeatedly struck by the healing power of connection, created by being fully there in the quiet understanding of another. In it, none of us are truly alone. The power of presence is not a one-way street, not only something we give to others. It always changes me, and always for the better. So my pitch, my appeal to you is that we can all be present for the kids in our lives, professionally, personally, educationally, socially. There's a million ways we can be present for kids. Our own kids, our kids' friends, our neighbors' kids, kids we see in our practices. I like to say that there's a lot of things that probably each of us can't do very well. There's certainly a lot of things I can't do very well. But each of us can be present for kids. And when you think about the extension of that, the extrapolation of your caring about the kids in your practice or kids you know in other ways, and how that multiplies out, it's a phenomenally powerful effect that you can have and are having, I'm sure, in the Winston-Salem community. So let me sum up by saying there's a lot of scary stuff going on with tweens and teens. You've heard the statistics. Parents pick up my book and they shake and they go, do I really want to read this? And I say, yeah, it's a hopeful book, actually, my publisher tells me. But there's also a lot of good news, and I talk about that good news in my book. I'm, as one who sort of travels around the country talking about youth risk behavior, it's really easy to quickly become the Darth Vader of public speaking. But I always take the time to talk about all the great things about our kids that sometimes we lose sight of. So I'd like to close by focusing on that. My friend and colleague, Rich Lerner, who runs the Center for Applied Research in Youth Development at Tufts University, has done some very similar research to mine and published a book very similar to mine at the same time. So we're good friends, but now we're competing. And in his research, Rich identified what he calls 5 C's that are resident in young people. And they are competence, confidence, connection, character, and caring. And what Rich says is that these may coalesce in a 6th C called contribution. In my research, I found the majority of teens say they feel happy almost every day and perceive themselves as friendly, honest, and smart. Most say they can handle change well and are liked by others. Even more good news can be found in the fact that most teens say their relationships with their parents make them feel good about themselves. that their parents respect them and that they feel close to their parents. And a research from Opinion Research Corporation, hold on to your seat, actually says that the majority of young people say they want to spend more time with their parents. Who would have thunk it? Right? It runs counter to that image of adolescence as a time of self-absorption, moodiness, and conflict, or storm and stress, as identified by G. Stanley Hall, who was the first president of the American Psychological Association. But it's important to get word out about the true nature and character of kids today. So I'll close with an essay that was written for a special edition of Newsweek by a young man named Brad from Waterman, Illinois, because I think it makes the point that I am trying to make. His story is titled, "Against All Odds, I'm Just Fine." And it goes like this. What troubled times the American teenager lives in. If what is being printed in newspapers, viewed on television, and repeated by adults is correct, it is against all odds that I'm able to write this article. Adults say that the average teenager can't find Canada on a map. According to their statistics, my favorite hobbies are sexual intercourse and recreational drug use. It's amazing that I've found time to write this. From what they say, my time is spent committing violent crimes or just hanging out with a gang. In fact, it's even more amazing that I'm here at all when you consider that the music I listen to is supposedly warping my mind and influencing me to commit suicide. Nonetheless, here I am. I write this to show that a teenager can survive in today's society. Actually, I'm doing quite well. I haven't fathered any children, I've never worshipped Satan, and I don't have a police record. I can even find Canada on a map, along with its capital, Ottawa. The kid, when I do that with kid audiences, they go, Ottawa, right? I do it with adults and they go like this. Or this is my favorite, there's usually one in the group that'll go, Toronto! Because those geography lessons are way back there in the rearview mirror. Right? Anyway, I can even find Canada on a map along with its capital, Ottawa. Call me a rebel, but I've stayed in school. And can it be true? I enjoy it. I'm looking forward to college and to becoming a productive member of society. I may not be America's stereotypical teen, but that only goes to show that there's something wrong with our society's preconceived image of today's teenager. Thank you so much for your attention. I'm happy to take questions that you might have. And I want to point out for the record, I'm 2 minutes ahead of schedule. I tell my kids at camp that early is on time is late, and late is unacceptable. So, anyway, questions? Yes, ma'am.
My oldest child is 10, but we see what's coming down the road, and there's a lot of peer pressure among the parents to condone drinking and other behaviors. Give me your car keys, stay in our house, versus parents that say, no way, this is against the law, you're not doing this, and you send your child out and on the road. So what do the children think about parents who condone it versus, and what do the statistics say about that in 2 minutes?
This is like the debate. Thank you, Candy. This is an issue, again, that I'm terribly vested in. Everywhere I go, this is a problem. You have, and the parents that show up are the ones that are not providing the alcohol. The ones that are don't show up. And I like to say, even if you think as a parent that it's the right thing to give your child alcohol, what gives you the right to decide for somebody else's child? And that's what they're doing when they provide alcohol for their children and their children's friends. Not only is it against the law, I happen to believe that it's morally reprehensible, and it places kids at risk. And state legislatures are starting to legislate against that, and are starting to throw, well, not the legislatures, but the courts are starting to throw those parents in jail. Even if they say, well, we were upstairs watching TV, we had no idea. Really? Because the people in the house 5 houses down called the police because of the noise, right? But that's what they said. So I get pushback from parents. I was actually banned from a private school in Massachusetts, Buckingham, Brown, and Nichols, after speaking there for a decade for free, because they're in my backyard, because I challenged parents in a Q&A on that point, that they wanted to say, well, no, they're in my basement, I take the car keys, which, you know what, I wrote a column recently called The Myth of the Car Key Basket, because what kids will tell you is, yeah, we put the keys in, they go get distracted, we take the keys out, and we drive home. Okay? So that doesn't work. And don't you think it's better that my kids drinking at home rather than going out with his friends into the woods. Well, I wanted to test that. So guess what? You know how this ends, right? So I found not only are kids who are allowed to drink at home, not only are they not less likely to drink with their friends elsewhere, they're overwhelmingly more likely. And it's even for kids. We looked at kids all the way down the spectrum. From kids who come home from school, open the refrigerator, take out a beer, and drink it in front of their parents, to kids who are only all the way down to kids who say, yeah, I can drink at home, but only on special occasions. Like New Year's Eve, I get a glass of champagne. Okay? Same effect. Okay? Why? Because you guys know this better than I do. Their brains work differently than ours. They don't see those. I used to say shades of gray, but then that book came out. So they don't see those nuances, right? If it's okay for me to drink with mom and dad on New Year's Eve, why isn't it okay for me to drink in the parking lot behind the supermarket with my friends on Saturday night? That's the way they view that. So, it's just not true that it demystifies alcohol use. It makes it more likely that kids are going to drink otherwise. So that's my soapbox answer. I don't know if that was 2 minutes or not.
What do you think the legal drinking age should be in this country?
Minimum legal drinking age. People chase me around the country. I've debated John McCardell several times on National Public Radio. He's founded the Amethyst Initiative, which on the surface says we simply want to have a dialogue about lowering the minimum legal drinking age, but his sister organization actually advocates for that, so it's kind of a smokescreen. My answer, it's a great question, and I could spend 60 minutes talking about it, but I won't. So I will tell you this. In all the work that I've done for 30 years in this field, I have not seen one shred of evidence, not one piece of data, not one brain imaging slide that leads me to believe that lowering the minimum legal drinking age would do anything other than create more problems. And when people say, my favorite is when people say, yeah, but they don't have these problems in European countries, right? Because we demystify it. That's simply not true, okay? That's simply not true. Every European country, other than Turkey, every European country with a lower drinking age than the United States has higher rates of youth intoxication than does the United States. So there's a lot of misstatements out there, a lot of facts that are being presented that aren't really facts. Sound familiar? Shocking. Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
You talked about positive risk-taking versus negative risk-taking. What are some examples of positive risk-taking?
That's a great question. We struggled with that when we designed the study because we sat around a table, my research team, we said, okay, so what's a positive risk, what's a negative risk? And as people started to throw out their answers, it became abundantly clear that the only way to answer that question was to let kids answer it, right? So we went out and did pre-research to have kids identify what was a positive risk. Because for some people, I played football, believe it or not, for a while. That was a risk, right? I mean, deadly risk. I was also a competitive swimmer. That was not a risk. But for another kid, playing football might not be a risk, but jumping in that pool might be, right? So every kid has to define it for themselves. And so the way we designed the study was such that in the actual quantitative measure, kids could self-identify what was a positive risk and what wasn't. And then we were able to, we were able to sort that into different areas. So there was academic risk, there was social risks, and there was another category, I forget what we called it, but it basically captured sports, extracurricular activities, drama, all kinds of activities that kids could engage in. And then they, then through the survey, we were able to cross-tab kids who took positive risks in their lives as they identified them, right? And went outside their comfort zone with those risk behaviors. Okay. I think I got time for one or two more. Yes.
I guess my question might be a little bit awkward at home, might not have percent, but usually I see that kids, like what you say about the teenagers, young teenagers that start drinking. I know I heard about couple of them through my son's when he talks to me. But the amazing thing is there are things that they're known, and like for example the activities that are going on in buses when they go to school, and there's so many hideous stuff that we know, but yet but yet even the school system, even the community, it's very hard to to try to save these students or these teenagers, even though they go and they might show some drinking, they look drunk, or they like you say, they go wasted, So I mean, it's very hard to see where we're standing, and as a parents, as a community, even as a professional workers.
It is, and one of the things that we're talking about doing in our work, and talked with Dr. Pranikoff about, I'm also working with Geisinger Medical System in Pennsylvania and Partners Healthcare in Massachusetts, is developing better measures in patient treatment room to figure out what the reality actually is. But I want to touch on another point that I think is related to that and exacerbates this problem, and it is social norming theory. Everybody here familiar with social norming theory? It's really complicated. It took me a long time to get my head around it, because basically it says that people want to be normal. We want to do what everybody else is doing. The problem comes when kids misidentify the percentage of their peer group that's engaging in risk behavior. So if you ask teenagers, what percentage of your peer group drinks alcohol, they will report in the low to mid 90th percentile. If you ask them about marijuana use, it's upper 90th, okay? Of course, those numbers aren't accurate, but they think they are. Same with drinking. And so that's another reality gap that we need to close. You guys are in a great position to do that, to really have a dialogue with your pediatric and adolescent patients about what those numbers really are. So let me give you a quick example. In my research, 63% of middle school and high school kids have said that they use alcohol. 63%. That's an epidemic. But it also means that 37% of all middle school and high school kids in this country have never used alcohol, not once. That's a lot of kids. That's a big peer group with which we can help kids align and assimilate. But that social norming is very dangerous. How many people here are on Facebook? Those people? So I was, a couple of years ago, my nephew, my namesake, was a senior in high school in Maryland, and he was a lacrosse player like Ben. And it was spring of his senior year, and I got one of, the little chat thing, it makes that really cool little boinky noise. So I get the little boinky noise, and I look down, and it's my nephew, Stephen, and he goes, "Uncle Stephen, guess what?" And he had 4 question marks after it. So I knew he was really excited about something. So I thought, okay, either A, his lacrosse team won states, which they were competing for, or he got into college. So I wrote back, and I wrote, "What?" And I put 6 question marks after to demonstrate that I was even more excited than he was about his great news. And he wrote back and he said, and this was like March or April, he said, "I quit drinking for Lent." And I thought, why is he telling me this, right? And I wrote him back and I said, "Why are you drinking in the first place?" And he wrote back and his response was, "Because I'm a teenager." Right? That's how they define it. That's the social norming. I'm a teenager, that's part of what I do. Right? So we have to be really careful about that.
So what did you follow up with to help you change?
I said, well, let me tell you a little bit about my research, Stephen. One last quick thing. You guys have been great. The other way that comes out is an adult's willingness to provide alcohol for kids, because they say, 53% of parents say, my kid's going to drink no matter what, and so a lot of them are providing the alcohol. I finished dinner one night on a Saturday night in Charlestown, a neighborhood in Boston I lived in for a long time, and I was walking home in the dark. It was about, 9:30, 10 o'clock, and I walked past this alleyway behind a liquor store, and I heard, "Psst, hey, mister." And I stopped, and this kid came out of the alleyway. He looked like he was in 7th grade. And I said, "What's up?" And he said, "Can you help me out?" And I said, "I don't know. What do you need?" He said, "If I give you some money, can you go in and get me some liquor?" And my first thought was, wow, does this kid, do you realize he just asked the national chairman of SAD to buy him alcohol? But my second thought was more sobering, if you'll excuse the expression, of, how many times does that happen on a Friday or Saturday night all across this country? And the answer is yes. So you probably want to know what I did, right? I took his money and I ran. Anyway, I forgot to close the loop on Brian. Long story, very short. Brian concerned me by his behavior in that focus group. So I did something very unorthodox. I got permission from his mom to talk to him. Unorthodox because I was there as a researcher, not as a psychologist. I got permission from his mom to talk to him individually afterwards. In fact, and and said to him, I said, look, Brian, I know you just met me, but I care about you because I care about kids. And I couldn't leave here tonight without asking you if you're okay. Because what I saw through that mirror concerned me. And Brian started to tell me his story, which was that his parents had just gone through a bitter divorce. His father was an alcoholic. His father rarely saw him. When he did, he would take him to bars and make him drink along with him. He was depressed, anxious, and actively suicidal. I asked him if his mom knew that, and he said no. And I said, do you want her to know? And he said yes. And I said, well, how about we tell her? And he said, as long as you do, you'll do all the talking. So we got Mom in. We talked. We opened the dialogue. I ended up helping them get a therapist. And this was 8th grade. Every 2 months, through the rest of middle school and all of high school, she would email me and give me a progress report. And every time, Brian was doing better in the aggregate, right? It's never A to Z. It's 3 steps forward, 2 steps back, but he's always doing better. In the spring of his senior year of high school, she sent me an email and said, so this is now almost 5 years, 4.5 years later. She said, when we were going through the darkest of times, Brian said, Mom, if we ever get through this, we're going to go to Hawaii and sit on a beach to celebrate. And she wrote, I'm currently making plane reservations for Hawaii. Brian graduated, moved to New York, called me up. I had not talked to him since 8th grade. Came up to see me. I saw him when I was speaking in New York. He just moved back to Seattle. He's got a job, he's got a band, and he got married about 4 weeks ago. And he was talking to somebody who happened to be talking to me and described me in a very laudatory way, a very almost embarrassing. And my view was, I didn't do anything brilliant that night. It certainly wasn't some great clinical diagnosis that this kid was struggling. I was simply an adult like you who cares about kids and who took the time to say, hey, are you okay? And I shudder to think of how many adults passed him by and never asked him that question. And it's proof positive of the power that one individual has, just by circumstance or by intention, to really make a difference in a kid's life. So that's my message today. Thank you so very much. I appreciate it.